Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI, a policy discussion series hosted by Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. I'm your host, Nirjan, Principal Advisor at PEI, and I'm joining you today from Cairo, Egypt. We're about 2 weeks away from the March 5th elections in Nepal, a moment that feels like the culmination point of last September's Gen Z movement. The interim government formed in the immediate aftermath of the uprising had a Herculean mandate, among other things, to pull off a national election in a short 6-month window. And despite all the hurdles, it looks like they are actually going to meet that deadline. Right now, all forces, from the political parties, both old and new, to the Gen Z activists, seem fully immersed in the electoral process, both online and on the ground. To help us unpack the intricacies of this political moment, we're joined by Professor Alok Bohara from the University of New Mexico in the United States. Professor, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Would you like to take a moment to give us a brief introduction to yourself, your work, and your current focus in Nepal?
Oh, thank you very much. Let me start by saying I always enjoy talking to young youths because I think the way I'm looking at the whole Gen Z movement from that perspective, that Nepal needs to move in a direction that's led by youth, or at least a big input from the youth of Nepal. About myself, I'm an economist. I recently retired about 6 months ago. I was with the University of New Mexico for about 38 years, right? And I also started about 20 plus years ago Nepal Study Center. We've been doing lots of conferences and bringing all the young scholar of Nepali as well as other origins to come together and share ideas and so on. So that's been a very good platform to bring knowledge folks, right? So that's been my one. And in terms of my research interest, I've done lots of health, environment, and governance, that kind of thing, right? And empowerment. And I've carried out several field research in Nepal, about 18 or so, some in Kathmandu, Baunipati, as well as lately a lot of those in Lumbini province, right? So that's my research focus.
Let me just bring in my co-host, Saumitra Neupane, who's joining us today from his field visit in Bhairava. Saumitra, for those who haven't met you already on the pod, you are the executive director at PEI. But more importantly for today, you are our eyes and ears outside the capital city. And let's begin with your brief observation of what you're seeing in the provinces with regard to the upcoming elections.
Yeah, hello everyone. Just out of context that I'm here in Bhairava for a field visit. It's a very good opportunity to kind of gauge the election atmosphere outside Kathmandu. I was kind of disappointed. I did really kind of think that the scene here would be electrifying, unlike Kathmandu, like door-to-door campaigns, but that seems to be not the general trend these days. Looks like many other places, the election campaigning has moved from physical space to the digital space. So the context as it looks is very tepid. The exception being, if I may say the name of the party, RSP, and their own campaigning strategy. The RSP, Rashtra Swatantra Party president, visited Butual and the region this week, and there was a massive crowd that actually turned up to greet and join the movement. The photos from Butual are going viral. A very big mass that had joined. I did manage to talk to one of the young Gen Z voters there, and she was saying that it almost felt electric. I was not there, but this is her words, that it felt electric, that she felt that it felt like they were part of a larger moment in the country's history, and then that the whole movement was very galvanizing. The momentum seems to be shifting to new parties, new in inverted commas, in the sense that people here generally know who they don't want to win. I found a lot of voters saying that. Well, they've not said they like the new parties, but they generally seem to prefer newer parties over older parties. I did manage to talk to another elderly woman in a village nearby, and then it really kind of struck me by what she said. That she felt that she had to play a part for a change in Nepal. And what was really interesting was that she kind of went on to elaborate that how some urban constituencies and Kathmandu were very fortunate to have newer parties in the last elections, while the same was not the case in other constituencies across Nepal. And now that moment had come for a change. So it looks like there is a preference for new, and then people really don't care about agendas as such of political parties. We would have to wait and see what the situation will be come March 5th. This constituency is pretty large. There are 5 electoral constituencies in Rupande. Some are very urban, some are really rural. There is also a constituency which has 36 candidates running for a single post. I think that is one of the highest across Nepal for these elections. So some interesting observations, but really can't say which way the wind will blow.
Wow, fascinating. 2 things I guess I picked up, and which I think are very important points. I'll ask Dr. Bohara in a while, but so the campaigning has gone online, it's very digital, and the other one's demand for something new, right? I do have questions for Dr. Bohara on this later, but let's go back to the earlier moments of September, because we need to, I think, set this stage to come to the elections part, right? So let me switch over to Dr. Bohara. Professor, you've been incredibly prolific over the past 6 months on your Substack, Nepal Unplugged. And I'll be relying heavily on those writings and the frameworks you've developed to guide our conversation today. To begin, I want to go back to some of your earliest pieces, written immediately after the events of September 8th and 9th. What I really appreciated at that moment in your writing was that it almost felt like a journal form analysis, if that makes sense. I mean, you weren't just reporting on events as they were happening. You were simultaneously, systematically trying to analyze them, which is far and few at that moment in the media. Can you walk us through what you were seeing then, especially at a time when people were really struggling to make sense, right? So for instance, on things like if this was a movement, it was a protest or an uprising. If you've noticed, I've used all 3 words interchangeably today already. So in that sense, how were you managing to wrap your head around everything that was happening? And maybe I'd ask you to also, looking back, how would you evaluate your analysis? What do you think you got right? And maybe a few places where your analysis has evolved since then.
Okay, that's a very, very good question. This is exactly what I was expecting from this conversation, to have a little bit outside the box conversation, right? So over the last 6 months thing you said, back in 2023, May 7th, I had written an essay, kind of a warning that the country's all the dynamical game that we've been watching, like like the musical chairs of governance, and then the way they're handling corruptions, and the way people were expressing their frustrations on the street, the way youth are leaving the country. If you look at a lot of these things, it just what I started seeing this as fast forward that this Genji, you can name it anything, but this uprising, whatever you want to call it, what I call it, emergence, right? It's an emergent phenomena. You have to kind of think about that. So it's not pre-planned. It's not some leader leading a crowd. No, it's just like something that came out of this complexity that we are observing in Nepal. All the dysfunctionality, decision-making going, not in a proper direction, everything, something had to happen. So I wrote that in 2023. I appealed to systems complexity literature, saying there's this complex phenomena happening, and there's certain thing is going to emerge, and what's going to emerge is going to trigger and collapse. So that was the some sort of a prediction. 2023, May 7th, I wrote that. Like Nepal's system or politics is on the verge of collapse. That's what I did. And then your Gen Z happened, September 8th, and I said, look, I'd been saying and writing about all of those different factors interacting, leading to this Gen Z thing. That was my thinking. And then I started putting two and two together instead of reacting to the event, right? Who did what and when? Why did it happen? So I started focusing more on the why part. And I'll be happy to kind of give you a little brief, which is, so there are two things at work. One was what we call the lived experiences of Gen Z. So when I say Gen Z, it's like a less than 30 years old crowd, right? That's what we roughly do that. So less than 30 years, lower than 30 years, and two experiences. One is called the lived experiences, which they were watching and reacting and getting frustrated with. So think of the Nepo baby movement. And remember, a lot of these are also copycatting, right? I mean, the copycat, right? You see in Philippines, you go, oh, that makes sense. And this is exactly what's happening in Nepal. So this group, unemployment, high unemployment, right? Any lack of educational opportunities. So 100,000 kids always leaving. So there is a financial pressure also, right? Where to go, how to support your educational thing, because the Nepal was not fulfilling those educational standards. Corruptions everywhere, not, like with impunity, no one was punished. And then you had all these voices of anger, directly, indirectly, like Harka, Kulman, Balin, these are the alternate voices, even Rabi, right? And then this crowd was also exposed to other countries, similar movement, digitally savvy. I think they know a lot more than what you give them credit for. That's the one lived experience that this digital crowd was experiencing. I call it lived experience. And the other one was structural fault lines, right? And that's the part people are not seeing it. And I wanted to focus on that structural fault line. And that's what I was writing about, right? Look, these structural fault lines are going to get us in trouble at some point if we don't take care of it, right? And so that would be what I call elite overproduction. So Nepal was creating positions and power and, like a lot of elite production. Actually, if you look at the entrepreneur business registration in Nepal, you have more political cadres than the number of registered businesses. And the second thing is called I said, okay, there's this thing called wealth pump economy. So it's called wealth pump model of economic model. So wealth pump economic model is that you exploit the general population and the resources comes out of that, you feed into the elite to enjoy and keep up their lifestyle. For example, if you think about Nepal education system, right? You have a private school, and the private school kids who can afford, and after they graduate, they all go to Australia, America, Canada, Europe, and so on, right? And all the public school, most of them, public school students, especially if you do not graduate from high school, they all end up in the Gulf, Malaysia, everywhere, right? Right now, like 100 plus countries, they're heading out to do job, right? That's the migrant economy. So that migrant or the remittance economy falls on the poor segment of the society. So think about that two-tier system. And yet this remittance economy, you get like what? Almost 1/3 of your national GDP is covered by remittances. And all that dollar amount, they have a $17-18 billion in the central bank. And what are you going to do? Who is enjoying it? All the investment. elite class is enjoying that hard-earned money by those blue-collar folks. Then the second thing is I call it overall, it's called extraction control nexus. Okay, so think about that for a minute. How does it work? So you extract the resources from the poor people. I already explained, right? Billions of dollars. And then of course, you're tapping into that resources. And then what you do is you control the institutions so that you don't get punished, and you manipulate all the, let's say, investigative body, police force, all the consular body, you control that. So you don't get penalized. So they control the system and they extract the resources. So if you look at it from that angle, you're going to say, of course, something is going to give at some point, because this kind of a fragile system is not going to last forever. So
can I ask? Yeah, I was going to actually get to the question of trigger, right? So you laid all these lived experiences, overproduction of elites, the wealth pub. So that laid the foundation for the rupture. So the rupture is imminent.
Yes.
What was the trigger that what do you think was the trigger?
So let me give you one simple example. So are you by any chance have any educational background in ecology or forest or biology?
No.
I'm just asking. No,
Not me.
So it's a very simple concept.
Right.
So, yeah, that's fine. So think of a forest, right? Big forest. And what happens in big forest, and that happens in Nepal, in America, everywhere, that the leaves, right? The forest leaves, they fall. Where do they fall? On the ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it falls every year. So it piles up it's called fuel. Lightning strikes and it wipes out the whole forest. So that's the piling up the leaves under the tree. It's called critical point. It reaches a critical point, and smallest of the trigger can spread this fire all across the forest area.
Nepal, do you think the trigger was the ineptitude with which the crowd control was done, and then which eventually resulted in the deaths of 19? Was the trigger that it required something of that nature to actually begin that rupture?
No, I'm talking about the trigger before that. Okay,
before that. Okay.
Yeah. So trigger is something that they find very, very disturbing, right? For example, in this case, it was just a social media ban, right? So that became sort of what everybody felt. All the kids live on it, they thrive on it. So that became a trigger. And it could have been any other trigger, right? So that's the trigger for everybody to find a common cause and then go online and then organize. And it's what I call it's a self-organizing swarm, SWAR, swarm, self-organizing. Okay. That's what this crowd was. So there's not one leader, but you can also have a lot of infiltration in it. So trigger doesn't have to be one thing; it can be anything.
Okay.
Anyway,
let's move into kind of the second segment where we're trying to unpack Gen Z as a political force. So here, how do you observe them of how they evolved? So the event happened, and so they were pretty much nameless, faceless entity, right, during those protests, and the fact that they were able to coordinate in that new political moment while also having contestations around their own identity and their agenda as different characteristics of individuals who are all part of Gen Z came together, right? How do you make sense or how do you see this contestation within themselves as they negotiated with the established political force?
Okay, so I call that Gen Z uprising what means shock, right? It's a big shock that fell on Nepal's system, okay? So, and then the system was in a very disequilibrium, or I would call suboptimal level, right? Because people are very frustrated. The same people, sharing the PMship, everything. So nothing was able to destabilize that kind of a collusionary politics, nothing. And then when Gen Z happened, then everything collapsed because it's the system they had, like after 1990 and subsequently for years, was very fragile because institutions had to be they had to be checks and balance, right? So you have to have legislative body, different from executive body, the judicial, so they're all the same. So same people appoint each other and they protect each other. Meaning if something goes wrong here, the whole system collapses. Okay, so Genji that. So when it collapsed, you're asking me, okay, so what did they do? Well, it was not organized. But the way to think about Genji's thing is they're good at disruption, but not in coordination. So that's the whole thing, right? They are good disruptor, but not a coordinator. And they're not, I don't expect them to be a well-coordinated organization. Otherwise, the whole idea of this Genji, whatever that fluidity, it's just not emergence, right? Because I'm saying this is the emergent thing. It's not organized. If something happens, collapses. The question is, after that, so I'm saying they are, it's called, sometimes you can even call it, in economics, it's called Schumpeter's idea of like constructive destruction. Okay, remember that? Constructive destruction concept. So these guys were disruptor, but constructively they did the disruptions. Why do I call it constructive? Because it forced the systems to respond. Political parties were forced to respond. Government was forced to respond, whether wrong or right. I'm not talking about the wrong or right, but the government responded with dissolution and new interim government. So the question, how do I see it? Yeah, they're not a coordinated entity, Genji. They're good in disruption. And then you can think of as I call it like weak ties versus strong ties. So think about that for a minute. So when you have a 30 plus Genji units, right? And then Sudan has his own thing and BOM has another, and everyone is, and there's another guy, I forgot his very original, what's his young Genji? Anyway, so all these 30, 35 different entities, it's called, and they're doing their own things. It's called weak ties. And the whole idea of strength is in weak ties, because when you have weak ties, it allows you to invent, innovate, come together if a common cause, otherwise, evolve at your own pace.
In that moment, there was some sort of demand on the Gen Z, because it's like, who are you? What's your ideology? So people were expecting, but what you're saying is they were there as they were there for the purpose of constructive destruction. You said they were fluidic entities. So to expect that was probably not the correct way to interpret Gen Z. If I were to try to think through what you're saying. However, in one of your Substack pieces, you make an interesting point where you say Nepal does not need more Gen Z parties. It needs a Gen Z powered youth civic alliance watchdog, right? So can you unpack that? Because if you go from that moment where they were trying to figure out their own identity, they've evolved with some people now in the electoral politics. Some are still in that civic space. How do you see them now, and what do you think their role will be moving forward?
I think that's a very good question, right? So what I was watching was, so they were saying, okay, Genji has to be a party, and let's bring Ballot to lead it, Harkal. And I'm saying, I think you're going to defeat the whole purpose, because this Genji movement, which is emergent, is not designed, or it's not equipped to do such an organized movement. I mean, it defeats the purpose. So Genji is like it came, right? So some people might exploit that to create a party out of that. Then you just become just another party. Well, you already have several parties with the similar ideas, right? Arka is very angry at the system, so he has a party. Balin is angry at the system, he has a party. Even Gagan is very not happy about the country and his party, he has a party. So it's not that Genji is not there. Yeah, they all are taking the Genji, what I call agenda, and working into their own system. They're doing it. So why do you need other people again doing the same thing? Instead, if you stay outside and your strength is your digital prowess, right? You have a lots of energy. So let me just kind of pause and give you three sort of a tier of generation. I want to come back to early question about the intergeneration. So less than 30 is your Gen Z crowd, right? Which is like they're impatient and they feel everything in urgency, right? You want now. I'm not happy with how the country is going. We want result now. So that's a high energy group, less than 30. And then you have a 30 to 40, which is engineer, doctors, all the educated, technical, but very mobile because they can go to Australia. They can sell their skills anywhere in the world, and a lot of them are doing it. And yet they are being very open to embracing Gen Zs. Like I've seen lots of those conversations where 30 plus educated, skilled, whatever you want to call personalities reaching out to Gen Z and creating something, right? So that 30 to 40 years, and I'll put even like, for the lack of example, someone like Sagar Dhakal, let's say, right? He's worried about the country. He fought against Deuba, and then he's running around organizing with Gen Zs, and then he ends up in a party. So that's 30 to 40 is the what I call the bridge generation, which is skilled, highly mobile. They don't have to be in Nepal. They can go anywhere in the world. They can sell their skill. But then that segment is very powerful. And you have a under 30 impatient, energetic group. And then you have a 40 plus, 40 to 50, around 50s. That generation is trapped. I call them trapped generations. So if you look at all the parties, right, whether Nepali Congress or UML, there are lots of young folks, 40 plus, but they can't oppose. They've been just rendered very helpless. They cannot change their party system, and yet they have a good heart about Nepal. So there are lots of very well-meaning political leaders in those parties. And so that's what I call the trapped. And they can provide perspective. So first one is energy, 30 below 30. 30 to 40 would be like they can do execution. They're good in that, right? They're very knowledgeable and experienced and lots of skill. They can make things happen. And then the 40 plus will have a perspective, a little wiser maybe, and they don't like the current system, but they can't do anything about because they're trapped. So if these three generations come together, the 30s, 40 plus, and then the below 30, that's what I'm calling the intergenerational renewal. And that's, I call that the intergenerational renewal project, like an IRP, intergenerational renewal project, is what the Gen Z needs to focus on, not being a part of the party and all that.
So you're thinking that the...
Dr. Bohara.
Sorry, go ahead, Saumitra.
Yeah, no, just the moment of change when the new government was being formed. I like this idea of IRP. Did you kind of feel that there was almost a crisis of leadership? I mean, we've had leaders generally in political parties and very few in the public space. They were in public spaces, but in that generation between 30 up to 40, 50, it almost felt like there weren't many leaders outside politics in the social space or the political space, right? So almost a leadership crisis of sorts emerged where the Gen Z were trying. It was very difficult for them to place somebody in government. They ended up picking up icons that were already very angry with the government, as you said, or were kind of known public figures, considered neutral, or had done something well in the public space that is great for the country type of thing. But it almost felt that there weren't enough leaders for this generation to go to seek for help. And also this idea that I belong to that generation that is trapped almost right at that point in time. But even for me, it felt like I was a bit scared that the country was at a big moment of change, and the change was being led by a generation of individuals that, when they were negotiating with government, when they were placing demands with the state, that there wasn't enough political awareness or knowledge about governance generally that had to be when kind of taking forward these agendas. How did you see that moment of transition?
That's a very good question, and I'll answer that in two parts. The first one is, see, so this is not one of those guerrilla-led multi-party movement, right? There was a structure, chain of command. They knew exactly what they wanted. And then the parties, Panchayat party fell, and the king allowed multi-party. So they knew exactly what they wanted. Here, Prachanda got his comrade together and said, waged insurgency in Nepal. They knew exactly, we want constitutional convention, and then slowly they changed their demand gradually, but it is what it is, and went into republic. All right, so one fought for republic, one fought for a multi-party system, and the Genji, what did they fight for? Well, they wanted good life, development, no corruption, and they didn't want this big, messy governing system. So that's what they were saying that. And so they came into a scene and the whole thing collapsed. The question about the second part is then why didn't they have a support civil society, or I call intellectual, coming forward to lead them or at least be a part of them? And that brings me to this article I just published yesterday. I don't know if you are on my
Yes, I read that on the public intellectual.
Yeah.
It was quite a scathing article you wrote.
Yes, and so that's what explains your question, your second part, that because intellectuals are very important, right, in any survival or thriving of democratic process, because they play a role in terms of translating complex policies, being a watchdog of all the politics in the parties, and then explaining that to the general public, right, in a nonpartisan way. I think they did a wonderful job in 1990 coming together and creating multi-party. After that, I think they became, not all, they're very good intellectuals and civil society members. They're doing good work. But most of the, energy, everything has been sort of non-existent. And that's what you see. So when that Genji happened, you didn't see any civil society coming forward to take that, whatever the energy, and take it to the, certain direction. Instead, they were trying to find, like Harka comes from Dharan and say, I want to be the PM. And then there's another call goes to Bal and says, I don't want to be PM. It's all chaos. But instead of paying too much attention to that, the whole thing is there's always a vacuum. And a shock happened and there's a vacuum. And thank God we got into better transition, because the thing could have gone really, really wrong. And so I hope that we don't get to that position again. So anyway, so that's a long answer.
Okay. No, it's kind of, we're segueing into, I think, the third segment, which is about the political parties, which is at the other end of the equation of this movement, right? So this is a crucial topic because we kind of hinting at it already, because they were at the youth were against what they exemplified in terms of Professor Bohara, you're talking about how they failed to build the credible institutions in Nepal. So it is their responsibility, right? So I'm curious to hear your take on how you saw the established political parties respond to the systemic shock, right? When you look at the internal tensions or the lack of in some other parties. Can you walk us through how you were analyzing this? And it'll take quite a lot of time, so maybe just use the two major parties, because I think they're at the opposite ends of the spectrum, if you look at Nepali Congress and UML. And what does that speak to us about the future of political parties and their ability to reform as is the demand of the country?
Okay, so there you have two questions there. One is how will the political parties respond or behave in the future? The other one that you said was how did they respond to the current crisis, right?
Yes. So one leads to the other, right? So you get an
Yeah, yeah.
indication.
So
Right.
the way I look at it is this Gen Z movement or uprising, whatever you want to call it, I think it was not against the it was not against the leadership thing. It was not against a particular leader. I think what it did was it changed the incentive mechanism. That's what I call. So think of it as an economist, I call incentive mechanism, right? Which is it basically that Gen Z movement raised the cost of delay, right? And the cost of silence. So they raised the cost. That movement raised the cost. Okay, so what was the silence? Meaning for years, they were not taking care of people's business, right? Corruption was rampant and government was changing like every year. So you have 30 years of our democratic system. We have almost 30 government. I mean, that's just crazy, right? So when you have so much fluctuation, you don't have time to think about policy and development ideas, budgeting, you don't have time. You're spending a lot of time in this upheavals and collapse. So that's what the Gen Z saw that. And then next you ask, so what happened? So what he did was suddenly incentive changed, meaning, I'll just use name, Gagan, who was being very vocal for the last several months or even years to change something within his party, right? He always wanted to do, but he was never able to do that. But the Gen Z allowed that extra push for them to say, no, we want this special convention, right? So suddenly the whole people, this was a great opportunity for him to galvanize his support, and he went for it with some guts. Of course, he had to be bold enough to challenge, and he did that. And so that's the institutionally they did. And the reason they were successful was because Nepali Congress was a little bit of a loose organization, loose, not like the regimented UNL. So one is very rigid, the other one is relatively flexible. That's why Gagan was able to have that change that he wanted, right? So it's because of that. Okay. And what else did this Gen Z thing transpire? Well, even the individual level, right? For example, if you see some of the supporter of Gagan, like Dr. Shekhar Koirala, Dr. Sunil Sharma, I guess, and Chandra Bhandari, Dr. Minendra Rizal, and all this were sympathetic to Gagan's thing, but then they couldn't quite figure out, right? Should I be in the middle or maybe go and support the Deuba faction? So it's called institutional ambiguity. That's what I call, right? All that was, again, because of Gen Z's this system that created this kind of a ambiguity. And where it changed was when Election Commission gave their verdict within 24 hours, everything changed. So see, that's why removing institutional ambiguity is so important.
Dr. Bohara, just a very quick question. What should be the public interest around political parties? It almost feels like we have discussed so many things, federalism, inclusion, and whatnot, monarchy, and etc. at length in the political space, but we have not discussed political parties generally, how they should function, what should be their character. That conversation, I don't remember happening even in the 1990s. It almost feels that it's taken for granted that, political parties are there and then they'll be there and then they're the persons to lead. But we've never, as active citizens, talked about what kind of political parties do we actually need, how they should be governed, what limits should they have. Is that a space for public interest generally in other countries? And how do you see that being different in Nepal?
I think in Nepal, we thought that multi-party, free press, right to organize, right to union, everything would take care of everything, right? And the democracy will self-correct. I wrote this article about 2 weeks ago about it's illusion, self-correcting democratic process doesn't happen.
I did read that, yeah.
It had never happened, like in the US or UK, nowhere. It's a lot of work. So you have to have a sort of I'm not saying smartness, they're all smart in Nepal. I think all the politicians, there are lots of very knowledgeable people. But the question is, I think they should have focused on institutional building, right? Rather than the public complacent saying, I think the political party will do the right thing. No, they don't. You have to have what you call the democracy only works when you have a proper constraint in place. So democracy never works as free for all. No, democracy is not about it's as much about freedom as it is about the constraint you are in, and everyone follows that constraint. In Nepal, that constraining institutions were captured by the politicians, and we suffered from that. So 30 years was that. So there was no checks and balance, right? So all the constitutional appointments were appointed, in I don't say collaboration, but the power sharing game between the parties. And they all divvy up all the positions. So it's not going to self-correct itself. It's not going to go in the right direction. In fact, what I call is the middle corridor of what I call liberal democracy. It's called middle corridor. Why call it middle corridor? Because if you're not careful, it becomes autocratic, right? This way. And if you are not careful, then it can go where? The other extreme, which is the fragmentation of the country, like Somalia or Sudan type, right? So how do we keep these two in the middle, right? Not autocratic, like Panchayat, and not, let's say, fragmented, like, lots of countries that just break into several tribal warfares. We want to be in the middle. And that's being in the middle requires sacrifices in the sense that political parties have to behave like a temporary custodian of the governance system, right? Representing the people. Now, when the people give you the feedback, then they have to listen to it. Currently, we don't have that feedback mechanism. And I'll come to your second question, then what should we be doing? Well, one thing is the internal party democracy, which is like, how do you select your leader? How do you give tickets? How do you give, let's say, proportional seat? It's all controlled by 2 or 3 people at the top. Well, if you have a party that doesn't follow their own democratic ideal, how could they run the country, right? So that's why first business is to make that party operation democratic. Actually, you may know or you may not know that our Constitution clause number 269 4A. So look up. It says in our Constitution that it's a mandated duty for parties to run like a democratic system. But have we ever seen election commission calling them out? No. Do you think our parties are run like a democratic entity? No. So that's where the civil society or the intellectuals failed. They never demanded the political parties or put pressure on election commission to call the party out that, look, for example, there have been some examples in African or even European countries when someone unfairly got kicked out of the party, right? Let's see. So party structure kicked them out. They went to the court and then they got the ticket because the person claimed that I deserve that candidacy. And of course, the party system kicked him out. He went to the Supreme Court and got reinstated. Why don't we do that in Nepal, right? I mean, why don't we ask our election commission to say, look, why don't you examine our political parties and see how they function, how they appoint their leaders, how they appoint the candidates, right, or select candidates, and see if that is consistent with the constitutional provision. Nobody has asked that.
Do you think the recent constructive disruption with the Gen Z movement is kind of pushing political parties to to that direction? I mean, we've seen some parties kind of make those adjustments, some not, already delusioned in some ways. How do you see
I
that?
think for example, see, not everything doesn't have to be planned, because as I said, that within each parties, there are a group, they want democratic system. If you look at UML, there's some lower or third tier, they want a little bit different way of doing a party business. Same thing with Nepali Congress and other parties too. But then they never had, they were trapped. But so think of Genji as opening that space for dialogue, right? That's all. So it has opened the space for people to question, challenge, and then move their party towards some reform path. So that's because of the Genji. Gagan wouldn't have been able to do what he did if there had not been this Genji uprising.
Okay. Now, let's move to the last segment, which is actually the core segment of our discussion today, which is the upcoming general elections on March 5th and how to read the election outcome, right? So, Professor, looking up to the lead up to the elections, right? What stands out to you in terms of how the parties, both old and new, how they've been adopting to take part in the election? Saumitra mentioned it is very online. It is a lot of, I guess, like mimetic in this sense. These days, everything is digital. What do you think about the way that the candidates were selected, fielded, how they are going out and about in terms of getting votes? We did talk about a lot of more populistic, more that sort of, people are talking about people rather than the agenda. So how do you, what indicators are you looking at to see if we are headed in the right direction?
I think I have a slightly different perspective on the election, right? I look at this election from a pure observational standpoint, right? Not to make any prediction or direction. I think that comes, we talked about that after election. So if the Genji and the, if Genji manages to fill in that space or collaborate with the intellectual and the civil society as a non-partisan force, after election, that might bring about some laws and changes and so on, right? So I'm looking more beyond that and how Genji can play a role if they want to, instead of just joining the same thing like some political party and following some leader and so on. So that's the important thing. And in terms of how I see the election, I mean, it's just like a coffee shop friendly chat, which is speculative fun. So nothing more than that, right? So I'm not taking it as a systems or no, it's like a fun part. And it's very calculated. For example, Ballot going to, where did he go? Chapa, right? Constitution number 5 to challenge only. And I see that as a pure game theory, which is he just said, okay, I'm going to challenge the big honcho. And if I win, then I'm the undisputed leader of Nepal for next 10 years. And Rasa party will be my party or, whatever. I'll have a very good standing. And if he loses, nothing to lose. Because that's the way his personality is, right? He challenges authority. He doesn't talk much. Sometimes he also has a flair to write all kinds of things in social media. That's his personality. And that perfectly matches him when he went to Japa. Either it's like, I don't know, there's this thing called, I don't know if you know, called California or bust. Meaning that either I go to California, they used to have this sign in the 60s, hitchhiking, right? So they would say California bus, I got to go to California, otherwise my life is over. So it's like, for Ballot, either I'm going to challenge him and defeat, or what's the point of me being in politics? I think that's how I see his psychological thing. But I'm not a psychologist; it's just a fun conversation. Okay,
But do you see anything that's happening in the lead up to the elections? Do you see any anything just in terms of candidates, how they're behaving and all that marks gives you an indication that there is a real underlying shift in Nepali politics, so that all the demand for change that's happening? Or you think it's the same old, that at the end of, when we finish this election, we're going to be back to business as usual? Is there anything that gives you hope, or
I
maybe
don't know.
some
I don't
cynicism?
know. Sorry to interrupt you. I don't think that it's going to be business as usual. Nepal politics has changed, so it'll be different. So I don't think it'll be business as usual. I don't think that, number one. And the second thing is, don't pay too much attention to these YouTubers and all these chasing people and, kind of all that just happens in any election. Nepal is no exception, right? But where I would say is disappointing is that, Nepalese people are very smart. They know what they want. They've been asking good questions for a long time. The problem is that the politicians, because of our political system, were never compelled to answer. So think about that for a minute, right? It's not the lack of good questions. Like, you want good education, we want health, insurance, there's lots of agenda. They even, every election cycle, they will have a 30-page manifesto, right? Or someone will come up with, 100 days with 100 agenda we're going to do. All this is, I'm not saying nonsense, these are all needed, right? They're all needed, people are doing it. But it means very little, actually, in actuality or in reality. The reason being, our discourse in political arena is not very productive. What I mean by that is, our intellectuals, our civil society, are not making them answer the questions, right? This is where we are missing. So hopefully Genji will take up that space and compel politicians to answer. That's where we don't see that much happening, right? There's a lot of rally, and we're focusing on how big the crowd was, or all kinds of this visual thing is what and that comes with the territory. Like in any developing world election is like that. But that's where I hope some of you Genjis connected with them come up with good questions for candidates so they cannot run away from it. Force them to answer. See, that's not happening.
Yeah, I think we're already picking up on some really good questions, at least what we hear and see in social media. Just want to engage you on another point. We've had revolutions in the past also, 1990s, and then again leading up to the elections. It almost feels like there is a revolution, there is a generation that engages in a revolution, and then that burden of making politics accountable shifts. So that generation moves away from that burden of accountability. So we've done the revolution, but we don't really want to take part in making the government or politics accountable. It almost feels like that. Do you think this particular generation, because there is a generational tag associated with a revolution, do you think that they would want to take more ownership about making the government and politics accountable, unlike what has happened previously?
Hard to say, right? And sometimes you become the part of the problem rather than the solution, right? So that's the 1990 great achievement, but then they never understood why institutions were so important to first fix. They didn't do that. So it all comes down to the institutional arrangement, institutional checks and balances. They didn't do that. 2006, Maoists came to power, and they were more concerned about coalition government because they were not as big, and that you spend a lot of time on that. Genji coming. Now, they forced the system to respond for the first time. So they're doing that. But the question is that civic architect that they developed, will that continue in the future, or are they going to be personality-driven crowd? I'll be very blunt, right? Saying, oh, Ballot is the great thing, or Ravi, or Gagan. I mean, is that personality-driven? Or are you going to pause, Genji, and think about what all went wrong and how the new role should be defined for them that had not been there all these years. See, there has to be some soul searching for Genji also. So instead of just joining a party and all that, that's what I call momentary dopamine effect. You get a nice couple of interviews saying, hey, I joined this party, that party, and that's it. If you don't, so I think what Nepal needs now is a very young, creative, and you guys in Genjis are very digitally savvy. So use all that skill and organize in a disorganized way to see if you can make a difference as a civic force, non-partisan. I think that's where you should be focusing on, rather than kind of being a cheerleader of some individual leader.
Just a follow-up question, very quick. It's very difficult to make predictions on what is going to happen to the elections and who's going to win, who's going to not win. I don't want to engage you in that question specifically, but Nirjan, in his initial introduction to this particular part of the segment, talked about post-election scenarios. What kind of scenarios do you imagine is going to emerge? We know that it's going to be difficult to pass laws. There are going to be a lot of new people across different parties. But do you see even there in such levels of fragmentation, political fragmentation, that at least at this moment of change, there's going to be consensus on a few things? At least political parties across different lines would be able to agree, given that we've come to a moment in history that with the kind of change that has happened, that they would be able to agree on a few things at least.
I think one thing I'm very positively sure is that it's not going to be business as usual. I think things will be different. That's for sure. And I think the just going back in terms of the prediction, I don't want to predict, but if all the independent-minded, you want to call Genji or whatever, had gotten together under one umbrella, right, for the election. So like Harka, Sampang, Kulman, Balin, even throw in Rabi, whoever, if they had all united and Genji's tacit support, right, not the active participation, but tacit, yeah, this is our agenda is what we care. I think that group would have made a dent. Now they're so fragmented, right? Harka is there, and then Kulman is here, and then there are lots of other independent. They're all scattered. So in terms of electorally, they will not be as strong as if they had united under one umbrella. But moving forward, if they manage to say bring individually enough parliamentary members, then I think all I can do is guess, is that I think they would be on the side of change.
All right. Thank you, Professor Bohara. I think it's been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the Gen Z movement. You've given a lot to think about. I think one thing that I'll take away from this is your emphasis on institutions. I think you've consistently been writing about this. And I think this is something that truly needs to be amplified in the Nepali political discourse. And hopefully as PEI, we can take forward some of these ideas that you've mentioned. Saumitra, anything from your side before we give the final word to Professor Bohara?
Thank you, Professor Bohara. It's been a privilege and very insightful conversation.
Okay, for me, and good luck with this effort. I think this is a good thing you're doing, and wish you all the best. Thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to share what I had to.
Thank you.